Have you ever thought about where your produce comes from? Most grocery chains receive produce from various local and national farmers. In fact, there are about 3.4 million farmers in the United States today. But of that staggering number, only 45,000 are Black farmers. At the Better Buggy, we are a proud group of Atlanta-based Black-owned farmers, selling produce locally and nationwide. Our easy-to-navigate online platform makes it easy for you to make a one-time purchase or to simplify your life by subscribing to our weekly produce box. Whichever frequency you choose, you can order with confidence, knowing you'll receive 100% organic farm-fresh produce. If you're looking for a thoughtful gift for a loved one that they'd actually find useful, be sure to pop by our online store where you can snag a gift card your recipient can use to order their own produce and t-shirts. Ready to start supporting local Black-owned farms and making healthier food decisions? Visit thebetterbuggy.com now to start shopping.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's face it, the Constitution is a racist piece of toilet paper as far as I'm concerned. Okay, there's nothing good about it at all because it's intended to be for the high IQ and not really for anyone else technically. So, should we be surprised if there's all kinds of racist connotation around the Second Amendment? No. It's the legacy of the country. This is who and what they are and who and what they will always be in America. So, yes, it has historian roots that are racist, and nobody should be surprised by that. So, this is NPR, and historians uncover the racist roots of the Second Amendment. I'm going to play this audio for you. Now, it's quite long, and I'm not going to play the whole thing, but just a part of it.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Dave Davies, in today for Terry Gross. In the 1990s, gun rights advocates, including the National Rifle Association, condemned federal authorities' assault on the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, asserting that law-abiding citizens had a Second Amendment right to own guns for their self-defense. But our guest, historian Carol Anderson, says those groups have been noticeably quiet when police shoot African Americans who are legally carrying firearms and presenting no threat to the officers involved. In a new book, Anderson argues that sharp racial distinctions in Americans' treatment of gun ownership go back to the founding of the Republic. The language of the Second Amendment itself, she writes, was crafted to ensure slave owners could quickly crush any rebellion or resistance from those they'd enslaved. And she says the right to bear arms, presumably guaranteed to all citizens, was repeatedly denied to African Americans with brutal consequences. Carol Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Emory University. Her previous books include the bestseller White Rage and the 2018 book One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. Her new book is The Second: Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. She joins us from her home in Atlanta. Carol Anderson, welcome to Fresh Air.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
You open the book by noting there are some distinctions in the outrage of the National Rifle Association and other gun rights advocates over citizens' possession of guns. You want to cite an example or two of this?
Yes, and what drew me to this book was the killing of Philando Castile up in Minnesota. And here was a black man who was pulled over by the police, and the police officer asked to see his identification. Philando Castile's, using the NRA guidelines, alerts the officer that he has a licensed weapon with him. So he has a licensed gun. The police officer began shooting. So here is a black man who is gunned down for having a gun. And the NRA went virtually silent, and was only pushed into make what I call a non-statement statement. Oh, we believe that everybody should have the right to bear arms, regardless of race. And nothing more after that except to say, well, we can't really weigh in on this until after the investigation. But this is the same group that called federal officers jackbooted thugs for what happened in Waco and what happened at Ruby Ridge when federal officers were actually gunned down. And the question was, do Black people have Second Amendment rights? And that's what I went looking for. Do we?
And you take us on a journey back to the days of colonial times and pre-colonial times. This is really fascinating stuff. Gun rights advocates cite the Second Amendment with, an almost religious devotion, talking about the right to bear arms. People forget the other part of the amendment that talks about a well-regulated militia. There's interesting history. Let's just go back. In the mid-18th century, in the Revolutionary era, what were the state militias? I mean, what did they do? When were they assembled? What was their function?
The state militias, particularly the state militias in the South, their primary function was to put down slave revolts, to buttress the work of the slave patrols, who were there to go into the slave cabins looking for contraband, looking for weapons, looking for books. We saw the role of the militia primarily when you had a massive slave uprising in Stono, South Carolina. It was called the Stono Rebellion in 1739. South Carolina responded with a law saying that if you found an enslaved person trying to get to Spanish Florida, scalp them. Also responded with the 1740 Negro Act that defined who the enslaved were. They are absolute slaves for now and for those not yet born, and that they do not have the right to access to weapons nor to books. And so really setting up the parameters of slavery and what would be enforced by the militia and by the slave patrols.
So certainly in the South, African Americans didn't have access to firearms, and slave owners were very vigilant about suppressing any resistance or rebellion. Then comes the revolt against the Crown of Great Britain, and there was a need to raise a continental army, and there weren't as many soldiers as the founders hoped they could get. And there was a question, what about African Americans' ability to serve in slave states and in non-slave states? What was the policy?
And the policy in 1775 was that no African Americans, no Black people would be able to serve in the Continental Army. But a series of British victories and the fact that the militias were proving not to be up to the task of fending off a professional army, and that you weren't getting enough white men to enlist in the Continental Army, to volunteer to fight, really began to change that policy. So one of the things that you saw happening in the North was being willing to emancipate their enslaved people, their enslaved men, if they were willing to fight for the Patriots. That began to, so this is one of the things, there was slavery in the North. You have Connecticut and you have, I believe, New Jersey that are saying, okay, fine. If you fight for us, you will be free.
And the British had their own offers too, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. They realized that there was a large enslaved population here in the United States or in the colonies that wanted freedom. And so the British offered that any enslaved man who was owned by a rebel and would fight for the British would gain his freedom. And you had this mass exodus of enslaved folks running to fight for the British because of that offer of freedom. And this was sending a panic through the colonists. There was this fear. I believe Benjamin Franklin was like, they're going to have our Negroes fighting armed against us. And the Patriots had said, no, we are not going to have Black people fighting in the Continental Army. So when you have this mass of black folks fighting for the British, and you don't have enough white men fighting for the Patriots in order to really staff the Continental Army, and you've got the militia that's really not being able to fend off the British with any kind of level of effectiveness, they were having a personnel crisis of the first magnitude.
Right. And, you're right that after the war, the sort of narrative was that African Americans had betrayed their country by all fleeing to the British and supporting the crown. The reality was something different, wasn't it?
The reality was very different. After the Patriots had opened up access to fighting, is that you also had a wave of black men then joining the Continental Army, and that they served longer terms. They had a lower AWOL rate than whites, and they were paid less. But they were willing to fight for this nation. And that Continental Army was an integrated army. Something that we would not see until the Korean War.
Right. And what did they get for it?
They got a narrative that they were the enemies within. They got a narrative that this was a nation conceived by and fought for by only white men.
The Second Amendment was crafted after the Constitutional Convention as part of the Bill of Rights. And it, of course, talks about a right to bear arms. It also deals directly with militias, particularly state militias. How was this an expression of racism in its day?
It was in response to the concerns coming out of the Virginia Ratification Convention for the Constitution, led by Patrick Henry and George Mason, that a militia that was controlled solely by the federal government would not be there to protect the slave owners from an enslaved uprising. And it was the way that James Madison crafted that language in order to mollify the concerns coming out of Virginia and the Anti-Federalists, that they would still have full control over their state militias, and those militias were used in order to quell slave revolts.
Right. So the fear was that a union which was dominated by northern states would simply not see those militias for the same purposes the South did. They would take them for, draft them for other purposes, like from a foreign invasion, and leave the job of guarding against the slave revolt unfilled. So in the end, what happens is the South agrees to join the Union. But part of it was that they had an assurance that their own militias would be seen as independent, used for their own purposes, i.e., suppressing slave revolts, right?
Yes. In that, the Second Amendment really provided the cover, the assurances that Patrick Henry and George Mason needed, that the militias would not be controlled by the federal government, but that they would be controlled by the states and at the beck and call of the states to be able to put down these uprisings.
In the early years of the Republic, so citizens were guaranteed a right to bear arms in the Second Amendment, right? And state militias their independence was enshrined by the Second Amendment. There was this unanswered question of who exactly is a citizen, who have these rights. And Congress kind of addressed this in the Naturalization Act of 1790, right? What did they tell us?
Basically, if you had white skin, you could be a citizen. And your children who were under the age of 21, when you got your citizenship, they could be citizens. But what that did, that Naturalization Act, it basically left free blacks in this quasi space of denizen. Not quite enslaved, but not a citizen either. Not with the full rights of citizenship.
So citizenship really out of their grasp at that point. So the South had gotten, the independence of their militias. What rules governed the private possession of weapons as far as black people in the South or the North after the Revolution?
You saw incredible restrictions being put in place about limiting access to arms. And this is across the board for free blacks and particularly for the enslaved. And with each uprising, the laws became even more strict, even more definitive about who could and who could not bear arms. And so free blacks were particularly prescribed. And so we see this, for instance, in Georgia, where Georgia had a law that restricted the carrying of guns. And in a court decision, the court ruled that that law violated the Second Amendment. But what the court did not do was to also overturn the Georgia law that prohibited free blacks from carrying weapons. So that same court did not say that that law that prohibited free blacks from carrying weapons, owning arms, that violated their Second Amendment rights.
All right. So, as you can see, the Second Amendment has been very Black unfriendly. And see, they always want to keep this unfair advantage over the Black community where you don't have weapons, they got weapons, and you have no way to defend yourself. See, they like it like that. They like that unfairness there. So you can see from their unhumble beginnings, they have always sought to keep weapons away from the Black community, and they're still like that to this very day. Look at how the cops react. They got a gun. They got a gun. And you be holding a cell phone. Okay, they still got that in them. We still see it to this very day. This ain't the past. This is very much the present. But y'all, please tell me what you think. Please leave your comment and subscribe. Don't forget to hit on the notification bell, and I'll see you on the next video. Peace, family.